I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today is part whatever of our long Lu Xun series, and we have another fantastic guest on today.
People come out of the woodwork, not even out of the woodwork, really. Everybody wants to talk about Lu Xun, so it's been exciting to see just a cavalcade of guests. And anyone you say, hey, do you want to talk about Lu Xun? Almost everyone goes, yes, please, I want to do that.
And it's funny you should mention that, Rob. I think Alec is kind of coming out of the woodwork, because
I would say almost literally coming out of the woodwork.
He's in Dali. Alec Ash, let's welcome him to the show. Alec, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure. Long-time listener, first-time guest, so I'll come out of my tree trunk anytime.
Nice.
Thank you so much. Alec, you are in Dali in Yunnan in the wilds of southern China. Is that correct?
That is correct. Last time I checked, I left Beijing in 2019, and so I've been out here for the last 2-3 years, writing a book about city escapees in Dali, and generally enjoying the beautiful environs out here in southwest China.
And is it snowing down there now?
It snowed recently, so the mountain range, Changshan, is a glitter with a fresh frosting, and it's looking particularly pretty.
And we should mention, this is not your first book that you're working on. You also wrote Wish Lanterns, which I think has been re-released in the U.S. with, as am I correct, China's New Youth?
That's right. That's the title they put on the U.S. paperback. Presumably to shift a few more eyeballs and make it seem topical when I was writing about people now in their early 30s.
You sound mildly like you're not entirely satisfied. I definitely think that Wish Lanterns was a much better title.
I agree.
Well, I pushed for Baby Dragons, but they didn't like that.
Oh.
Well, you know, once you appear on the podcast, I think the copies are going to go soaring off the shelves no matter what the title. So just strap in.
All right, now that Rob, I don't know if that's technically pieing Ma Pi or pieing our own Ma Pi. Can you do that?
I don't know if you can do that, but either one.
I'm sure you can do that, Rob.
Indeed.
I'm not sure a horse can reach its own ass. Just as a technicality.
Maybe it depends on the horse. I don't think it's a rabbit hole we really need to go down. But
my wife's a vet, so I'm sure she will
interested,
be able to solve this problem.
I don't think so.
It's a mental image.
So.
Should we turn to today's story?
We should. And in fact, I'm going to start Alec off with the question that we start just about everybody off with. Lu Xun wrote a lot of very interesting stuff, from prose to prose poetry to regular poetry to stories to any manner of things. When we chatted with, I guess, Lee, you did the chatting with Alec about doing an interview here. Alec, you were given the choice of any story to do, and your choice was a minor incident. It's very, 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 very short. Why this piece out of all the others you could have talked about?
Because it's very short. And I mean that not entirely flippantly. I genuinely like short texts. I think it forces the writer into concision. And I find that Lu Xun can be a little bit loose in his structures. Whereas this one is just a perfect little gem. And a short piece like that, there's a lot to unpick in it. So that was the first thing going for it. And secondly, I find this one interesting in that, to me, it slightly blurs the boundary between fiction and potentially non-fiction autobiography. It's not explicitly, at least formally speaking, it's not. It doesn't appear simply as fiction. I think it probably best is understood as a fiction vignette, but it slightly blurs that boundary, and as a non-fiction writer myself, I found the prose styling of it more interesting than the more conventional short stories.
Yeah, and I'll just, Lee, if you don't mind, I'm just going to summarize it real quick, the way that the listener has some idea of what we're talking about here. A minor incident is very minor, at least it sounds like it. It's written from the first person, but it's supposed to take place in the winter of 1917. The narrator is in a rickshaw. Because of the weather, ends up running down an old lady whose cloak gets her clothes get tossed up by the wind, caught around the rickshaw, she falls down. The rickshaw puller, against the narrator's wishes, again, very interesting, goes and helps her and picks her up and carries her on. The narrator is struck by the sight of the rickshaw puller's back as he helps the old lady across the street and to safety. Then A cop comes out and it basically tells the narrator, well, listen, you're going to have to go somewhere else. This rickshaw puller is taking care of this old lady, and we're taking care of the whole thing. And effectively, that's the end of the story. The narrator kind of walks off and reflects on how interesting it is that this incident, among all the others that he could think of, is the one that sticks with him.
I was struggling with that question about fiction versus nonfiction. Why do you take this as fiction? Is there anything in the story that tells you that this is fiction, other than the fact that it's in placed in between a bunch of other things that are clearly fiction?
Well, I think it is fiction. I think that is the correct reading. I think there are ways in which we might talk about how it perhaps chimes with Lu Xun's life and time in Beijing in a similar period. But the unnamed character in the story is wearing a fur coat and has a bunch of money, and he just hands out great handfuls of coins to the policeman to give to the rickshaw driver, and the implication is out of shame. And to the best of my knowledge, and I should flag that I know very little about Lu Xun's life, but he was not going around wearing giant fur coats, I believe. He came from a wealthy family, I believe, in Shaoxing, but it seems that the character, to me at least, that the narrator is not presented obviously as Lu Xun. But I'd be interested in your take on that. Perhaps I've misread it.
I absolutely agree with you. I think it definitely is fiction, but it feels so non-fiction-y. So I was just trying to kind of get at
that's the thing,
anything.
Right? That's the interesting thing, that when you look at it, you can realize that it's intended as fiction, but it feels like it's non-fiction. It feels like a blog post, formally. And in the writing, it's presented as a vignette of his experiences. And if you came across this in another context, which was not in a fiction collection, one might think that, which is part of what attracts me to it.
I knew there was something that I wasn't noticing, and the fur coat and the fact that he's handing out all of this dollop of cash, you're right, that doesn't sound like Lu Xun at all. So it's these tiny details that really tell us that this probably is fiction, other than the situating of this story in a set of stories.
I was going to say, Alec, you made a comment about this being intended as fiction, and I'm wondering if that was actually the case, in that this is still a period when first-person stories are relatively rare, right? This is not coming out of our tradition where everything you can think of could be in the first person. I'm willing to bet if you got a bunch of modern Chinese readers together in a room and gave them the story, based on the current narrative we have of Lu Xun in the PRC, they would all go, oh, yeah, this is clearly autobiographical, right? This is a guy who's noticing the corruption of the old republic, the old empire hanging on, et cetera, et cetera. This is a classic Lu Xun move you both mentioned with the fur coat and the money, because one of Lu Xun's greatest and most common tactics is to take a story that's working perfectly fine one way and just give you a little something to mess it up. So, this is clearly first person. Wait a minute. Why is he doing that if it's first person and it's him? It's not him, is it? There's a way to read this where it's clearly fiction and we read it a certain way. But do you think there's something to be gained by keeping both in tension with each other at the same time as you read it? This is definitely fiction. Wait, is it? Is it not? How are we supposed to read this? Are we supposed to read this in a certain way, or are we supposed to kind of just take both in tension?
Well, yes, I think that's a very interesting idea about what Lu Xun could be doing, which is experimenting with new forms of fiction in which a story is in the first person, which perhaps was an experimental way to do it in early 20th century Chinese literature. I'm not sure. Although there are other stories, I believe, in the canon where he uses the same technique. Upstairs in the Tavern is another one where the narrator is in first person and reacts in ways that Lu Xun himself would react. For example, being outraged that this acquaintance is being forced to teach the Confucian classics. So perhaps that's what's happening in this story as well, that it's a fiction story which is thematically non-fiction, in that the perspectives of the first-person narrator are very likely the same perspectives shared by the author, and that the reaction that this rickshaw passenger has, I think probably mirrors the same reactions that Lu Xun was having to the society of Beijing and China at that time. And then he's just taken those feelings and sort of probably pushed them into a neater, dramatic event in fictional form. But perhaps that boundary is less important.
Alec, I was going to ask you, so the story, it describes a man kind of coming to a realization, or a rich man coming to a realization that these poor people are not beneath him. There's a moral transformation that the unnamed narrator goes through at the end when he hands the cash, or right before he hands the cash to the police officer. He starts to perceive the rickshaw puller as it's almost like he physically becomes bigger, and that's I guess a moral transformation. So at the end of the Julia Lovell translation, Lu Xun, a Chinese American novelist, mentions this story, and she seems to argue that there's this sort of petty conceit, I think is the word she uses, of this man, and she doesn't. It almost sounds like she argues that this man doesn't really change much. He's just a rich jerk who throws his money around. Do you think that the unnamed narrator goes through a real transformation, or is he just throwing money at the problem?
He does come across as a bit of a jerk, and I think that's the point of the story. And including at the end, he is taken aback by the kindness that this rickshaw driver shows to this grey-haired old woman in ragged clothes, and he very much doesn't want him to help her. He thinks he saw the old woman fall, and he thinks she's all right. He thinks she didn't fall hard. It's holding him up. He doesn't want to get needlessly involved. And then when he sees that the rickshaw driver is helping her up to this police station, he describes it as him being physically and mentally paralyzed. So it's a shock to the system, and his initial reaction is a jerk's reaction. It's just to kind of buy off his conscience, and he gives a big handful of coins to the driver by way of the policeman. But then afterwards, the last couple of paragraphs of the story are a time shift. It shifts to later. In fact, gosh, it's just the last paragraph, which is a shift to later, and he's questioning, among other things, why did he give that money? And he wonders, did I give it as a reward? But I think the implication is that he gave it out of shame at his own behavior. And so that last paragraph is a paragraph of someone who has undergone a change and has been shocked by this event, and is thinking about the incident later, full of discomfort because, quote, it forces me to look hard at myself. So it's someone who's has been changed by this. And I'll just quote the last couple of sentences because they're important. And I'll actually quote from the Gladys Yang and Yang Xianyi 1960 translation, just because I think that this their translation of the last two sentences, I have a preference for their translation, whereas the rest of the story, I must admit, I prefer Julia Lovell's. So the last two sentences they have it are: the political affairs of those years I have forgotten as completely as the classics I read in my childhood. Yet this incident keeps coming back to me, often more vivid than in actual life, teaching me shame, urging me to reform, and giving me fresh courage and hope. And that is clearly the perspective of someone who's been changed.
There is clearly shame at work, but it's also oddly non-committal. The narrator never says, and I have decided to dedicate my life to writing for the poor people of China, or something like that. In Lovell's translation, the narrator's filled with discomfort. This thing has stuck with him. The last line here in Lovell's translation is bolstering my sense of courage and hope. But hope for what? Hope that the rest of the people of China will turn out like the rickshaw driver? Hope that he'll be better? It's just a vague, undiscussed word. So what kind of hope do you see him having?
Well, I like that comment and that idea that perhaps this is a false promise and empty words. And I think that satire might very well be intended. But to answer your question, I think we need to now step back and look at the story a little bit more emblematically and within historical context. So the first thing of note in the story is that while it was written in 1920, the setting of the story is the winter of 1917, and the narrator moved to Beijing 6 years before that from the countryside. And he'd say it begins with 6 years of my life have slipped by since I arrived in Beijing. So that would date him arriving in Beijing right in 1911, 1912. Another interesting element of the story which jumps out at the beginning, he talks of how these matters of national importance over those 6 years didn't leave any lasting impact on him, besides, quote, increasing my contempt for the people around me. And so what are these events of the last 6 years? It's 1911 to 1917. He was living through the Xinhai Revolution, the early years of the Republic of China, ROC, China's first election, the assassination of Song Jiaoren, the death of Sun Yat-sen, the ascendancy of Yuan Shikai as a new emperor in 1915 and his death the next year, the early rise of warlordism, the first buddings of the new culture movement. These are heady, breathtaking years in the early Republic of China. And this narrator begins the story by saying that they didn't make any impact on him. All that he remembers is it increased his contempt for everyone around him. And so one reading of the story then would be that this is a criticism of the early Republic of China as epitomized in this, or personified even in this narrator. This narrator is a sort of a new man who's arrived in Beijing from the countryside, new man in a new China. He is rich, he is selfish, he is grasping for self-interest. He is symbolic of the nation, perhaps. He's just trying to get to his destination quickly, off the hard labor of the working classes in this rickshaw. And he is uncaring for the masses who make China run. So perhaps this is what's going on. Perhaps Lu Xun is criticizing the rich and the powerful in the new China who are maneuvering for more riches and more power, while the poor still suffer, while inequality is still rife. And this could lead us to perhaps a just outright socialist or Marxist reading of the text in terms of the sort of a foil for his riches and selfishness are these two working class characters, this sort of poor beggar woman and the rickshaw driver who help each other out. And there is the imagery is of his fur coat contrasted with the rags that they are wearing. That's a detail drawn out in the story. So we see the working classes helping each other out. And this is 1917. And so to continue, perhaps this is the point which portends new hope for China. This is also the point where the new culture movement really gets going, where May 4th is about to follow in 1919, a year before the story is written, but 2 years after it takes place. So, a symbolic reading would say that perhaps this fresh courage, this fresh hope is a hope for the way in which the Republic of China moves past that perhaps selfish, grasping early infancy into the teenage years of something new, perhaps couched by that caution around whether it's just empty words or not that Rob talks about.
Well, it could also be, we look at Lu Xun's own life. Between the period when he left Japan and when he starts writing The Diary of a Madman, roughly 1916, 1917, it's published a little later, you could easily say that he's filled with possibly loathing, certainly disappointment in all of the years he passed there. He writes about that in the introduction to Nahan. And one wonders as well, in this story, if he's taking the first-person narration as a way of sort of airing his own disgust with himself as a writer and a scholar during this period.
Yeah, I think that autobiographical reading is a great one as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he landed in Beijing from Japan in 2012 or something like that, working for Ministry of Education. 1912. If only 2012.
If only
he was still with us. 1912. He landed in Beijing, and then 1917, I believe, is when he started writing for New Youth, that famous Iron House passage. So it's his awakening, just as that is the date of the awakening of the character in the story.
Alex, he bookends the story, like you said. It's bookended with these references to this wider question of politics, should we take the socialist reading of the story seriously? Lu Xun is kind of casting the rich as these self-conceited people who it's only when they see in front of their eyes this example of the working class helping each other out that they recognize their failings. Or maybe, I mean, does the narrator recognize his failings?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's more a story about rich guilt than, the working class characters are incidental to it. And so the perspective is very much of how the incident affects the elites, which Lu Xun was, I suppose, part of in intellectual circles, at least. So I think that as a writer, he's not so boringly didactic to make it just to sort of pay on to the working classes. I don't think that's the kind of writer he is. But the focus would be on how the sort of the rich and powerful in this new China ignore the masses, which I think feeds in also to May 4th and all of the stuff that follows, and of course the beginnings of the Communist Party soon after.
As we're starting to wrap up, I wanted to ask you how you see this story in a wider context. I mean, in today's China, does this story resonate? Do you see echoes of this when you were living in Beijing or now in Dali?
Well, the obvious modern parallel, which is the last interesting footnote for the story is of course how it might relate to this phenomenon of pengci, which, if readers don't know it, is this thing where people would get hit by a car and then sort of exaggerate their fall in order to get the compensation money, and the wider social phenomenon of people in need in public being ignored by passers-by, made most famous in 2011 by the case of Xiao Yueyue, a little girl who was hit by a car in Foshan in Guangdong, and 18 passers-by passed by because of the fear of legal involvement, that they'd have to take responsibility for the case, leading eventually to a Good Samaritan law passed in 2017. It's a little bit sort of glib to compare that to the story, because I think that's not what was going on. I don't think that's what the rich narrator was worried about. He explicitly says he just thought that the old lady was fine and didn't need help. But but what I love about literature is that we, the author's dead and all that, we can sort of interpret it as we like. And so it's a fascinating story to read in relation to this phenomenon in China in the last sort of 10, 15 years, where, and imagine someone being hit by an electric rickshaw today, and you wouldn't want to help them because then you might get sued for it. So what that says to the state of China in this capitalist phase of its socialism, and the sort of fear of reprisals in that respect, it's just an interesting thought experiment how this story would work or be rewritten if it was set 100 years later.
I wanted to throw something in here at the end too, because just about anything you read in Lu Xun has parallels running through modern Chinese history, because he was that kind of writer. One of the things that strikes me about this story is that the main character is narrates himself as effectively kind of an upper-class twit. But it's interesting because he's narrating himself as an upper-class twit. There's a huge difference, right? If you're narrating yourself that way, and then you narrate yourself realizing you're a twit, it presents a much deeper kind of person than you would ordinarily get. And I think a lot of times when I read the news these days in particular, what I see is people in power presented just as people in power. They have money, they suck, or they're leaving people to die, whatever. And what's interesting is that Lu Xun is able to present themes of the working class being sort of pushed to the side, but also not leave out the wealthy people supposedly pushing them to the side, saying, well, there's something going on with these people too. We're not always sure what, but there's a lot more going on here than just this one-sided socialist issue of the rich on this side and the poor on this side.
There's a self-awareness, right, Rob?
Yeah, there's a self-awareness there for sure.
Alec, before we take off, did you have any more thoughts on this story?
Well, just to piggyback on Rob's excellent comment, I think that Lu Xun himself and the writerly circles that he was beginning to get involved in at the time that the story is set, they were elite circles. They were not peasants. They were not working class. And so that self-awareness and that perspective from the elites of society, I think, is sort of meta in that the writings which were bringing to light the plight of ordinary Chinese and trying to transform the culture and the country in this period, in the New Culture and May 4th movements, were led by elites who didn't necessarily belong to those peoples. Ditto the founders of the Chinese Communist Party, Chen Jiuxiu and so on. They were not of that class. So I think that in that respect, the narrative of the story is emblematic of the narrative of China at that time.
I think that's a great place to end it. I think we're still struggling with that question of first-person narration. Like, where is Lu Xun in this story? How does his class play into everything? Alec, I really appreciate you coming on the show and talking with us about this very short but really packs such a punch, has so much behind it kind of story. Alec, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, it was my great pleasure. Thank you for bringing me out of the woodwork. Having seen you on video, I still don't believe that you're not related. But thank you for having me on the show.
Well, before we go, real quick, the obligatory social media mentions. On Twitter, we're Chin Lit Pod, Instagram, Chinese Lit Pod, and Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast, and the fourth mention is Chinese Literature Podcast at gmail.com. So contact us, send us an email or a tweet.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.